Let me tell you a little bit about me, just to get to know each other, ease into this. I came from far away to wind up sitting over there in that corner. I'm originally from Bogota, Colombia, which is a sprawling city of 8 million people on a high mountain plateau at 8,660 feet elevation, and above sea level in the Andes, and it's surrounded by deep green mountain peaks. It was very beautiful. And although I left Colombia with my parents when I was a little girl, and going back only for short visits every 2 years, these mountains here outside this building are surrogate mountains for me. They console me for the loss of those emerald green Andean peaks I left behind, whose imprint is still on my heart. A little bit more about me. I originally made my way in life as an academic. I got a PhD, and I became a philosophy professor. And I lived in that world of academic philosophy for 18 years, first as an undergraduate, graduate, and then as a researcher, working in an area of philosophy that overlaps with social psychology. Those years gave me incredible tools for understanding reality. They moved me to my core, and they permanently transformed the way I see everyday life. To this day, the insights and the way of seeing that I gained from my time in philosophy, I would say that they're my most precious possessions. And I would say second only to my children, but as the poet Rumi teaches us, your children are not your possessions, and this is a lesson that my small daughters also like to deliver to me frequently. So 9 years ago, I left my academic safe haven in philosophy to tackle the issue of climate change and global warming. I got my courage to leave from those wonderful tools philosophy had given me, and I desperately wanted to make a difference on this issue before I died. It was a shock. I went from living in the world of academic philosophy, where we carefully construct theories and explanations in the alternate universe of ideas, to grappling every day with the overwhelming bad news from scientists about the reality of what is happening. And that was what's happening with global warming, what's happening with climate change, and that was something that I really had only been peripherally and vaguely aware of as a student and professor. But I've found some really important things, and today I want to share one of them, which has been for me one of the most exciting discoveries of my search over the last decade to find tools to address the climate crisis, specifically the part of the climate crisis that has to do with communication. So you have to remember that I'm a former academic, and academics have this deep need to start out by telling you what they're going to tell you, because they're so afraid that you'll lose the thread and tune out. So here's what I'm going to say in this sermon, in a nutshell, up front, in the most straightforward, unfancy, heartfelt terms that I can find, because I so much want you to hear it. And then don't worry, I'll tell it to you in a more complicated way. And there's even going to be a handout. This is what I'm going to say. There's a terrible communication impasse in this country around climate change and a lot of other things, like immigration, guns, and racism. And no amount of information, science, or facts seems to make any real difference or help close the chasm on those issues, does it? And it's not because those people over there are stupid and ignorant, and we're smart and informed, and they should just listen to us. It's because they have a different worldview from ours, and they're invested in their worldview, and they protect it by filtering out information that threatens their worldview. Basically, they feel like society's going to crumble if we get our way, and so they dismiss our facts and our science. And here's the thing. They do it, but so do we. Only the thing is, we're not quite doing it the way they are, because they've actually gone a step further, and they've harnessed this psychological mechanism to build a thriving, social media-driven universe called the alt-right. Raise your hand if you're aware of the alt-right. Awesome. The alt-right functions as a recruiting ground for racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. And it's alive and thriving. I believe we have the power, we have the basis for a powerful reorientation of our political vision as progressives if we can get a grip on the underlying psychological mechanisms behind these communication impasses and behind the rise of the alt-right. So that's where I'm going. Thank you. So now let me try to bring you along and hopefully persuade you and hopefully fire you up. Okay, so many of you are well aware of this massive impasse on communication around climate change here in the US that I just referred to. We've got politicians and lay people extremely polarized on the issue, barely able to talk about it, let alone take meaningful action. And we have an entire climate denial industry spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year, big tobacco style, to spread disinformation about climate change at all levels of society. A recent study estimates that figure to be closer to 1 billion annually. So the good news is that in social psychology recently, they've been madly trying to understand the psychological mechanisms behind this phenomenon, behind this communication impasse, and they're really making progress. In particular, there's new research from a group called the Cultural Cognition Project, based out of Yale and Stanford. This research helps us understand that there is quite likely one powerful psychological phenomenon behind both the situation with climate change in the US and the rise of Trump. They call this phenomenon cultural cognition, but we can call it worldview-motivated information bias. And I'm about to explain it, but keep in mind, we progressives are also subject to it. Okay, so here's where the fun starts. So all of you should have, in your order of service, a two-sided handout. So figure 1 is a grid made up of 2 axes, which are used to pin down someone's core political worldview. In other words, the kind of world they carry around in their political imagination, the kind of world they think works best. So one axis, the vertical axis, the hierarchical egalitarian axis, what it measures is this. If you're up here at the top, that means you lean more towards a worldview in which the traditional status quo is right and good. And so, if you're at the way top, you're an extreme hierarchist. Whereas if you're more down towards the bottom, you're an egalitarian, meaning you hold a worldview in which the status quo is unjust. It harbors many systemic injustices, and it should be challenged. And in which case you're an egalitarian, and you can be anywhere along that line. Make sense? That's the first axis. So the other axis, the horizontal axis, measures something different, although closely related. It measures whether your worldview leans towards individualism, meaning that you believe that individuals are strictly responsible for their own well-being, and you abhor outside interference in people's lives, specifically from the government. Right? That's what we mean by individualism here, right? Government hands off. People should pull themselves up. People are responsible for themselves and their own well-being. Or on the other extreme, if you're a communitarian or you lean towards communitarianism, you believe that it's society's job to provide for all of its members. And, if you're all the way at the end, that makes you an extreme communitarian. You with me? Okay, so these two axes, these researchers argue, are a much better tool for understanding the political reality we live in here in the US than a single liberal, conservative, left-right horizontal axis. That's part of what I want to bring to you today. Take a moment to think about yourself and plot yourself on these XY axes. So you're going to need to draw on the skills you hopefully learned in high school here about plotting X and Y coordinates. So the question is, first of all, let's take the vertical axis. Where do you fall on the vertical axis? Are you a hierarchist or are you an egalitarian? And are you a strongly so or weakly so, right? So you have to consider, if you know you're an egalitarian, what kind? Strong, egalitarian, or weak? And put a dot there. Or if you're a hierarchist, are you strong or weak? And put a dot there. Yeah, makes sense? And do the same with the other axis, the, I guess, horizontal one. So are you an individualist or a communitarian? And again, strongly so or weakly so. Where on that axis do you fall? So put a second dot on the appropriate position along the horizontal axis. So I'm going to kind of look out and see how you're doing with that. And then, of course, you know what comes next. After you have plotted yourself on both axes, right, go ahead and draw a line to the point where they intersect. Yeah? So draw a line to connect the two dots and put an X where they intersect inside one of the quadrants. And I'll give you a minute to do that. And once you've done it, just for fun, you could take a moment and compare with your neighbors. Okay, so now if you flip it over, you'll see more about the punchline of this research, which is that once you know where someone lands on this political worldviews grid, you can then predict with a high level of accuracy their biggest concerns about threats to society. And here's the thing. If you know that, then you'll easily be able to predict what kind of information they're going to dismiss or filter out. So listen close. People will largely ignore or dismiss information that suggests that the things they think are threats to society are not really that harmful. Similarly, people will largely ignore or dismiss information that suggests that things they think are not threatening to society, like climate change, are actually harmful. So that's an example. Let's look at some other specific examples. So look at the top left quadrant. Top left quadrant on figure 1. These folks are HIs. They're hierarchical individualists. HIs, their biggest fears, their beliefs about what is most threatening, not to themselves personally, but to society as a whole, are what? Gun control legislation. This is what you see on figure 2. We see that their biggest fears about what's threatening to society are things like gun control legislation and environmental regulation, including, of course, legislation to curb carbon emissions and rein in climate change. Why? Why? It shouldn't be too hard to see why. Why are they threatened by climate change? Why is that loom large as climate change regulation and environmental regulation? It looms large because that kind of regulation is threatening to the status quo that they're a part of. It's threatening to global economic systems. It's threatening to the importance they place on shrinking government. If we need, as a part of effective, meaningful climate action in time to stop what's coming, you need effective government action. And this is a worldview that is invested in the importance of shrinking government and these other things. Okay, so now is our turn. Look at the bottom right quadrant. Down here, the bottom right quadrant, that's the egalitarian communitarians, and on figure 2 on the back, you can see what it is, what do we fear? What do we see as the biggest threats to society? Our biggest fears stem from climate change, guns, etc. And that means that ECs and HIs basically see the polar opposite things as threats to society. And the hardest pill to swallow here is that it turns out that individuals from all 4 worldviews are subject to this kind of worldview-motivated information bias. So people from all 4 worldviews filter out information that challenges their deeply held vision of the kind of world they prefer. So I'm going to give you an example. Us, in the egalitarian, communitarian worldview, nuclear power also looms large as a big societal risk. We consider that to be a big societal risk. And so these researchers demonstrate that we tend to ignore or dismiss the scientific evidence that's out there on the relative safety of underground nuclear storage. And it gets worse. Statistically speaking, the more well-educated we are as egalitarian communitarians, the more background we have in math and science, the stronger our bias, the more we tend to discount the evidence. That's not pretty. And of course, we're not talking about any one of us in this room. This is statistically speaking. Okay, so this research is telling us that we all suffer from information bias, and that the cause of this bias is that we are defending our worldviews from information that would challenge them. I think there's a deep message here that can help rebuild our morale and reinvigorate our political commitment to action. I honestly find it moving. It means that everybody, including the rabidly racist and the wildly ignorant and the crudely xenophobic folks that we know are out there, everybody is harboring a vision of sorts of the world they want to protect. It's just that, in my opinion, their vision is dead wrong. In an odd way, this gives me hope. It recharges my batteries because it gives me the conceptual tools I need to stop bashing my head against the wall of "they're so stupid and ignorant," like it's just an incomprehensible wave of delusion that has taken over the country. It makes me want to fight their worldview by supporting real, concrete, on-the-ground efforts to protect and build up the world we envision, the world that ECs have been fighting to protect and build up for generations. So, for the call to action for this sermon, I wanted it to be something really, really practical, really hands-on, and so I've decided that I want to make an introduction. I would like to tell you about 2 organizations. The first one is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and the second one is here in Colorado. And both of these organizations are using a strategy, an overall strategy, that fits very well with the research I've been telling you about. Okay, so if you ignore everything else I've said, please listen to this next bit, okay? So here is my most urgent reason for wanting to make these introductions. A big takeaway from cultural cognition research, like I said, is that the left-right, liberal-conservative axis that dominates our collective political imagination cannot explain the complexity of the circumstances we're living in today. It's not intelligent enough to explain what's going on. If your model of the political universe here in the US has only this single axis, you will not be able to predict things like the massive groundswell of support for Trump. It will blindside you. Okay, so here's the problem. Even though that axis is an oversimplification, the idea of bashing the left just fires up people in those other 3 quadrants. It fires them up. And even though they have different worldviews, they are united behind Trump in their hatred of us. And this is especially true of the alt-right, who will join forces with literally anyone if they think it can hurt the cause of egalitarian communitarians, or as they call us, social justice warriors. And they have other, more vile names for us. Okay, so back to the call for action. The great thing about both of these organizations I have in mind is that they're helping to fight this dynamic by using a better psychological frame that reshapes our political imaginations and motivates people to reassess their fixed political views. It moves people. So let me tell you why. Let me tell you how it works. So the first organization is one that I know through an acquaintance and Facebook friend of mine who helps to lead it. His name is Jonathan Smucker, and he's a lifelong political organizer who lives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Okay, so in the immediate aftermath of the election, he and a group of organizer friends called an emergency mass meeting. Don't you wish you could have attended an emergency mass meeting for progressives on the day right after the election? How many of you think that would have been a balm for your wounded spirit right after the election? Right. At that meeting, they launched a new grassroots organization. It's called Lancaster Stands Up. That's the one. So I want you to look it up. I'd love for you to read about it. I'm going to quote from the Nation piece that was written about them in May 2017. Lancaster Stands Up is focused, listen, is focused on a nonstop campaign to resurrect the practice of progressive politics in the heart of Trump country. Not in a liberal bubble, but in the heart of Trump country. Lancaster Stands Up frames their message using bottom versus top imagery instead of liberal versus conservative, left versus right imagery. My friend Jonathan explains that this is because people tend to be fixed about where they stand in relation to the labels liberal and conservative and left and right. So if you frame things that way, people already made up their minds. They're not listening. In contrast, when they hear bottom versus top messages, many people are much more open to reassessing where they stand. Why? Likely because in this highly unequal society, there are so many people who are nowhere near the top of the status quo, and so they don't automatically feel threatened by this framing, and instead they feel empowered by it. So the opening invitation from Lancaster Stands Up is simple and polite. They present themselves as a way for people who are sick of the status quo to come together and to get plugged in. But what they're ultimately seeking, as my friend Jonathan Smucker puts it, is to push Democrats to fight for everyday working people. And he adds, there's an urgent, pragmatic reason for this bottom versus top reframing. By relying on the traditional liberal versus conservative political messages, progressives simply cannot achieve the congressional supermajority that we need to take back this country. At the most, we can achieve a slight and tenuous majority in Democratic safe districts. So now I'm going to close with the more local call to action that you can immediately act on. So I'm featuring an organization. I'm going to tell you about an organization with a similar strategy right here in Colorado, and I would like to invite you to check them out if you're not already familiar with them. It's the local chapter of an organization called the Working Families Party. And I've invited a representative from Colorado Working Families to join us this morning. His name is Michael Baca, and he's very friendly, and he's here with us today. Here he is. And he's ready to talk to you in the multipurpose room after the service. So I myself am just getting to know them, and what I can tell you is this: they're not a traditional third party. They don't run third-party candidates. Instead, like Lancaster Stands Up, they're working to build an inclusive, multiracial, progressive political force, supporting candidates running on the Democratic ticket who will fight for ordinary working people here in Colorado. So in the spirit of introductions and new beginnings, I invite you to get curious about Colorado working families and strike up a conversation with Michael after the service. Thank you for letting me share my passion for breaking through mass communication barriers this morning. I hope I've succeeded in the primary goal of all philosophers, which is to help people see and understand the world around them differently and hopefully a little better.